This bill says $100 trillion. It's not a joke. It's not a prop. It was real currency, printed by a real government, handed across real counters in real shops in Zimbabwe in 2008. And it was worth about $40. By the following week, it was worth $4. Within a month, it was barely worth the cotton it was printed on. This is the story of a country that had everything: fertile land, a functioning economy, a stable currency, and then printed itself into oblivion. And the most disturbing part? It didn't happen overnight. It happened step by step, decision by decision, until the math simply broke. Hey, I'm here on Money Origins, where we dig into the history of currency, economic collapse, and the stories behind the money in your pocket, in museums, and in collectors' hands around the world. If that's your kind of thing, you're in exactly the right place. In this video, we're tracking the full collapse of the Zimbabwean dollar, from one of Africa's most productive economies to a country where prices changed multiple times per day and store owners wrote their prices in chalk because ink was pointless. We'll cover the land reforms that started the collapse, the printing that turned bad into catastrophic, what daily life actually looked like at peak hyperinflation, and how it all ended, with one of the most humiliating admissions a government can make. Stick around for the final chapter on how Zimbabwe actually escaped the crisis, because the solution was as extraordinary as the problem. Quick note before we dive in. This video covers economic history and is for educational purposes only. Nothing here is financial advice. Economic systems are complex, and historical events should be understood in their full context. To understand how badly things broke, you first need to understand what Zimbabwe actually was before the collapse. Because this wasn't a poor country that stumbled. This was a country with serious economic muscle. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Zimbabwe was considered one of the most promising economies on the African continent. It had a diverse agricultural sector, a functioning industrial base, decent infrastructure, and a currency, the Zimbabwean dollar, that was actually worth more than the US dollar at independence in 1980. One Zimbabwean dollar bought you more than one American dollar. Think about that when we get to the 100 trillion figure. Agriculture was the backbone of it all. Zimbabwe was called the breadbasket of Africa, and that wasn't just a slogan. It was a net exporter of food. Commercial farms, many of which had been established during the colonial era, were highly productive. Tobacco, maize, cotton. Zimbabwe was feeding neighboring countries and generating real export revenue. The economic foundation was genuinely solid. That's what makes what came next so striking. Here's where the story turns. And this is the point that historians, economists, and observers still debate. Because the intent behind what happened wasn't meaningless. The execution, however, was catastrophic. By the late 1990s, President Robert Mugabe's government launched what became known as the Fast-Track Land Reform Program. The stated goal was to redistribute land from white commercial farmers, land that had, in many cases, been acquired under colonial rule, to black Zimbabweans. The grievance had real historical roots. The redistribution that followed did not. Rather than a structured, compensated transfer of land, the process became chaotic and sometimes violent. Commercial farms were seized rapidly. Experienced farmers lost their operations. The people who received the land often had little to no training in large-scale commercial agriculture. The infrastructure, equipment, irrigation systems, supply chains fell apart almost immediately. The results showed up fast. Agricultural output collapsed. Tobacco production, one of Zimbabwe's primary export earners, fell by roughly 75% within a few years, according to historical agricultural records. Food exports turned into food shortages. The country that had been feeding its neighbors was suddenly struggling to feed itself. And here's the first economic domino. When exports collapse, foreign currency dries up. When foreign currency dries up, imports become impossible to pay for. And when a government still has obligations to meet, but no revenue to meet them with, there's always one last option: the printing press. This is the part of the Zimbabwe hyperinflation story that feels almost unbelievable, but the numbers are documented and real. When foreign investment fled, government revenues collapsed, and the economy contracted sharply. Zimbabwe's government didn't cut spending. It printed money to cover the gap. Now, printing money to cover deficits isn't unusual in history. Plenty of governments have done it. The problem is what it does to prices when there's more currency chasing fewer goods. Inflation picks up. Then the government prints more to cover rising costs. Inflation accelerates. Then it prints more again. And at some point, that cycle stops being a cycle and becomes a free-fall. Zimbabwe crossed that threshold hard. Official inflation figures, where the government even bothered to report them, were climbing into thousands of percent annually by the mid-2000s. The central bank responded by redenominating the currency, essentially slashing zeros off the banknotes. They did this multiple times, first removing 3 zeros, then 10 zeros, then more. Each redenomination was an admission that the previous currency had become worthless, followed almost immediately by printing the new currency into worthlessness as well. By November 2008, independent economists estimated monthly inflation at approximately 79.6 billion%. That's the figure. Monthly, not annual. 79.6 billion% in a single month. To put that in some perspective, prices were roughly doubling every day, sometimes faster. The Zimbabwe dollar collapse was no longer an economic story. It was a mathematical collapse of the very concept of money. So what does 79.6 billion% monthly inflation actually feel like if you're the one living through it? Because there's a gap between understanding a number and understanding what that number means for someone trying to buy bread. Store owners stopped using printed price tags. There was no point. A price tag printed in the morning could be wrong by noon. Instead, shops wrote their prices in chalk on boards so they could update them throughout the day. Not weekly, not daily, multiple times per day. You'd walk into a shop in the morning, note a price, leave to get cash, come back an hour later, and the price had changed. This wasn't a rare occurrence. This was Tuesday. The banking system became almost irrelevant for ordinary transactions. A TMS would run out of cash constantly. Long queues formed outside banks, not to deposit money, but simply to withdraw whatever the daily limit was, because holding Zimbabwean dollars overnight meant losing significant value by morning. People carried cash in bags, then in wheelbarrows as the denominations exploded. The $100 trillion bill, the largest denomination ever issued in Zimbabwe, was introduced in January 2009. It was worth roughly $40 at issue. Within days, it was worth less. Wage earners faced an almost surreal situation. A salary negotiated on Monday could be worth a fraction of its value by Friday. Workers started demanding to be paid daily, sometimes twice daily, so they could spend the money before it lost more value. Some employers started paying in goods instead of cash. Which brings us to the other economy that quietly took over, the one running underneath the official one. Barter came back. Genuinely. In 2008, in a country with smartphones and supermarkets and gas stations, people were trading eggs for flour, labor for food, fuel for medicine. Foreign currencies, especially the US dollar and South African rand, became the real medium of exchange. The modern hyperinflation playing out in Zimbabwe had essentially forced the country to revert to pre-monetary economic behavior while officially still having a currency. That tension between the paper in your pocket and the reality it couldn't reflect is what makes this story so striking for anyone interested in what money actually is and why it works when it does. Let's come back to that bill for a moment, the $100 trillion bill. Because for anyone watching this channel, whether you're into currency history, numismatics, economic history, or just the sheer visual absurdity of a denomination that large, this note deserves a closer look. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe issued the $100 trillion bill in January 2009 as part of the fourth series of redenominated currency. The note itself is actually a fairly standard-looking piece of paper. It's not dramatically oversized. It doesn't have dramatic artwork screaming, "This government has completely lost control." It looks, in many ways, like a normal banknote, which, in its own way, is the most unsettling thing about it. It was legal tender for a matter of weeks. By the time the Zimbabwean dollar was fully abandoned, these notes were worthless within the country. But outside Zimbabwe, they became collector's items almost immediately. Today, you can find the $100 trillion bill sold on collector markets for anywhere from $5 to $50 US, depending on condition, which means that in some cases, a collector's copy of this note is now worth more than it was when it was issued as currency. That is not a joke. That is one of the stranger facts in the entire history of paper money. For anyone into currency history, and this is the money origins audience, this note sits alongside the Weimar Republic's billion mark notes and Hungarian pengo denominations as one of the iconic physical artifacts of monetary collapse. A $1 trillion note is, in a strange way, evidence of how thoroughly money had stopped being money. In April 2009, Zimbabwe officially suspended the Zimbabwean dollar. Not reformed it, not redenominated it one more time, abandoned it. The government announced that transactions would be conducted in foreign currencies, primarily the US dollar, the South African rand, the Botswana pula, and a small basket of others. This was, by any measure, a remarkable admission. A government declaring that its own national currency is no longer legal tender in its own country. That the money it issued, backed by its own central bank, had failed so completely that the only fix was to stop using it entirely and adopt someone else's money instead. The dollarization worked, in the narrow sense that it stopped the hyperinflation immediately. When you're using US dollars, Zimbabwe's central bank can't print more of them. The money supply stabilized almost overnight. Prices stopped changing multiple times a day. Shops went back to printed price tags. The chalkboards came down. Shelves, slowly, started to refill. But the deeper damage, to agriculture, to industry, to institutional trust, to the savings of an entire generation, that didn't recover on a policy announcement. Zimbabweans who had held savings in Zimbabwean dollars watched those savings become worthless. The currency collapse wasn't just an economic event, it was a generational wealth destruction. And it's a chapter that anyone studying modern hyperinflation, or thinking seriously about what gives money its value in the first place, needs to understand clearly. One more note worth keeping in mind. Zimbabwe's story doesn't belong to a single villain or a single decision. Economic collapses of this scale are almost always the result of compounding failures, political, institutional, and structural, over years. Understanding that complexity is more useful than reducing it to a simple moral. The mechanisms matter. Let's run through what we covered. Zimbabwe entered the 1990s as one of Africa's most productive economies, the breadbasket of the continent, with a currency that had once outvalued the US dollar. Land reforms starting in the late 1990s dismantled commercial agriculture, collapsed exports, and eliminated government revenue. With no revenue and no restraint, the printing press ran. What began as high inflation became modern hyperinflation at a scale almost impossible to reason about. 79.6 billion% in a single month. Prices changed multiple times per day. Store owners wrote in chalk. Citizens carried cash in bags, traded in barter, and abandoned their own currency for foreign notes long before the government did. The $100 trillion bill, one of the most striking physical artifacts in the history of paper money, was issued, became worthless, and is now worth more as a collector's item than it ever was as currency. And in 2009, Zimbabwe did what no government wants to do. It scrapped its own money entirely and adopted someone else's. The Zimbabwe dollar collapse is, in that sense, a complete story, with a clear beginning, a catastrophic middle, and an ending that is equal parts pragmatic and humiliating. The question this story keeps raising for me, and I think it should for anyone watching, is the same question that runs through every episode on this channel. What actually gives money its value? Because Zimbabwe had the paper, it had the printing, it had the government backing, it had every formal attribute of a currency, and it still failed completely. That's worth sitting with. If you found this one worth your time, the next video is going directly to another moment when a government decided it could control money on its own terms, and the people paid for it. It's called the US gold confiscation of 1933, when owning gold became illegal. I'll explain exactly how that happened, why it happened, and what it meant for the dollar. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. This channel is building out the full history of currency, from ancient commodity money all the way to modern collapse events. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.